So I'm just taking a few moments here to summarise my podcast talk with Edward a few days back and take some time to go through some of the key takeaways. What I'd also like to do is to provide some clarity at the end around a number of topics which Edward mentioned, and I believe, from my perspective, just need a little bit more clarity because some people might be led to believe one thing when really what was said could be a little ambiguous, and therefore I want to maybe clarify ambiguity and certainly put a bit more clarity around my point of view on a certain number of these topics. First off, key stuff which Edward mentioned was there's very often within the organisation misunderstandings about what Agile actually is. This chimes absolutely perfectly with what I said in my book, and I think it's mistake number 2 where I identified that people involved at the very top don't really understand what Agile means and what it doesn't mean, and as a result have a broad set of understanding and expectations which sometimes aren't met, and this is what leads to some disenchantment at the top sometimes. So it's worthwhile making sure that we clarify and re-clarify, and as Edward goes to say later, to communicate 100 times over what it is we're looking to expect from this. But if we look at Agile here, in terms of the process at least, not organisational agility, but as a process, Agile is a rich set of tools that help people to solve problems. And that's basically what should be given to the teams as a toolbox or a framework of set of things to just go about doing the business of delivering great value for their business. Another great thing that we mentioned in the podcast, because it was one of these wonderful generative moments where we talked about Agile is not the ends. So look, a lot of people just put Agile in place because they think that's the thing to do, without really further understanding, look, what are we expecting to get out of this? So a little expression that we coined together there was Agile is a potential means, organizational agility is the ends. What we're ultimately looking for here is the organization itself to be agile, as opposed to just running agile processes. And I get sick to death of it sometimes when I hear people say, oh, agile is the only process you should be running in your organization. And I always refute this because, look, in years from now, you're still going to run some projects in a waterfall fashion. In some cases, you'll have very little process at all. So look, it's not all about agile. It's not all about waterfall, but you've got to actually pick and choose and come up with the best solutions for the organization. But certainly saying everything needs to be agile, as I heard in a keynote from Mr. Denning some years ago, in my belief is just demonstrates a lack of agile thinking. Sponsorship at the top is extremely important. And again, back to the book, mistake number 1. Sponsorship not at the top of the organisation. Sponsorship somewhere middle down the organisation. And that leads to all sorts of things. And I've listed a few of them here. But one of the things that most struck me is about the conversation, and I have to say I love Edward's turn of phrase sometimes. If you haven't listened to the podcast, it really is worthwhile listening to it, because again, having worked with Edward for some time, it just does make me smile with some of the things he comes out with. But one of the expressions he came up with was bean counters getting in the way. Now I remember reading somewhere that Peter Drucker had actually said in one of his final conferences to an astounded audience as the person who knows your company least is most likely the CFO, the Chief Financial Officer. And the main reason he cited for that was the Chief Financial Officer works on history. He's looking at the books that have come up in the past. There might be some forecasting for sure, but that's all based on what has gone on in the past. So what we want is future thinking, and this is where sponsorship and people who take the role of the visionary to actually drive forward the transformation so that the transformation begins to start to deliver some of the strategic benefits that the company is looking for. So this becomes extremely important. Use product owners from the business. Again, one of the key points Edward mentioned here was, but also use the right ones. The last thing you want is another form of dictator that comes from the business saying it has to be this way. And, of certain things that I've studied recently, I'm beginning to believe that maybe product owners aren't the only answer, because quite often product owners themselves might have 2 or 3 layers between them and the user or them and the customer. So therefore, they might actually be hypothesizing and maybe guessing what they think the customer wants, whereas the only thing you really can do is to actually go out and ask the customer, ask the user what they want. So by all means, use the right ones, and please always use the Agile principle of getting feedback as often as you can and as quickly as you can, because that's going to pay big dividends. So some other key takeaways: use of OKRs. Edward mentioned some great books, in the podcast, and I'm going to give you a list of those at the end that you can go away and look up for yourself. But OKRs, objectives and key results, are extremely important, and they measure what's important. And again, from a psychology point of view, you've got to be very, very careful about what it is you choose to measure, because what you choose to measure will actually determine the behaviours that are carried out in the organisation. And again, if we don't choose correct enough measures, we might end up with lots of gaming in the system, and that quite often is not very useful. Do take much time to explain and communicate, but this is worth the effort, about what the OKRs are. And of course, always update them. Quarterly reviews, very, very useful. Another key thing here is you don't need to use a big consultancy. And I have to take my hat off to Edward here, because in some ways I've always been a little anti big consultancies, because often I see them charging huge sums of money to deliver just mediocre benefits, and I don't really see the point, especially when you can hire someone like me who's a fraction of the cost of a big consultant, will give you just as good information. However, having said that, it's important to know that senior managers will believe more in a big name that will actually tell them, oh yes, this is the way to go. And certainly at this organisation where Edward and I worked, this tended to be the way. They charged a huge and astronomical sum of money for something that I'd done for the same bit of work for a fraction of the money. But I never even got to get in front of the leaders, because I was working in the depths of the organisation. The leaders would only talk to a big name consultant who would come and give them the same knowledge. But hey, that's life. I'm getting over it. I'm hoping now that other people will know that actually you don't need to use a big consultancy. There's a lot here I can say about Serve to Lead, and there's some summary points there. But look, the ultimate thing here is that what I really loved about Edward is he was, for me, was an inspiring leader when working at the organisation, because he gave me the opportunity to go out and do whatever I felt was needed. Now, of course, sometimes the things that I think is needed isn't what the organisation themselves might think they need. So in which case we might come to loggerheads, in which case it's always useful to actually provide that direction in which to solve problems. And too much choice can be a bad thing. So helping to make sure that people have a firm direction on what it is they need to do and the directions they need to go is extremely important, and that is the key job of the leader. Setting example, extremely important. And again, Edward's turn of phrase, is just, I just loved it. I have to put it in here, but behaving like a dick goes down badly. So it is so true. And so Edward did then share some top tips, which I'll go through really quickly. Spend more time advocating. Speak more to leaders and demonstrate success. Tell the story 100 times more is what he said he would have done better. Because look, to go out and keep on communicating, you can't over-communicate. And by communicating often enough and regular enough, then people will get the message. In fact, when they turn around and tell you to shut up, there's probably a good point in which you've actually got the message across because they're sick and tired of hearing it, in which case you can stop. Yeah? The next thing Edward mentioned was value engineers and build a community of business-aware engineers. Now, I'd like to add some clarity to that in a moment, but I'll take nothing away from what Edward has said here. Engineers are the lifeblood of the organisation in many ways, because they're going to start to build, and the engineers he was referring here to were the people who are building the websites. These people will put and craft something that will actually be extraordinary if you give them the tools and the environments to be able to do that. But equally, as I'll come on to in a moment, you've got to sometimes be careful of how much power you give them. Beat yourself up. Limiting factor is the rate at which you learn. Releasing past beliefs and learnings. I mean, here, what Edward is referring to is beat yourself up as a leader. Now, again, I'll provide some clarity on that in a moment. But unlearning before learning means you're going to have to work on your embedded habits. There's going to be stuff which you have learned as a leader from the year dot, and quite often some of it might not be very useful. So in which case, it's going to be very, very useful for you just to take some time to just identify what those habits are, and always recommend that a leader has their own coach to hold a mirror up to them. Working in the same old ways that they've always done won't bring about change at all. So I did promise you some clarity, and there was a couple of things that Edward said that, again, I'm not disagreeing with what he said here because there are some useful points in what he's saying, but again, to clarify some of the points. Little need for PMs. One of these things that I keep hearing in the echo chamber that is the Agile community is that you don't need PMs. That, to me, is absolute tosh. In my world, you still need people to carry out certain responsibilities. Certain responsibilities such as the things that live outside the team, that doesn't come under the purview of the team or the collection of teams. I feel that the job of the PM is to actually get all the stakeholders in the room and to actually have meaningful conversations and communicate with them. Communicate with the business visionary and the business sponsors, to use some of the DSDM terminology. I mean, even in SAFE, something which everyone else seems to be going out there and praising for some reason, which again just sort of baffles me, but I think I understand why. Even in SAFE, they have these things called release train engineers. You go and look at the definition of what a release train engineer is supposed to do. If that, again, is not a project manager by a different name, then I don't know what is. So again, people just need to get off this idea that you don't need PMs. You still need people who are going to carry out the roles of the PMs, but you just do it differently. And I think in the podcast, Edward did go on to say that he did have a management team around him, but he put them at the bottom of the hierarchy, which was quite a useful thing to do. Because if you have a project manager who acts in a command and control fashion and wants to dominate the teams and get overly involved in the fine detailed planning within the teams, then I understand that that sort of project management isn't required and is not needed and would be frowned upon. So in which case I'm happy to forego the point that there's little need for PMs if they're acting in that command and control fashion. Value engineers, absolutely. Look, do value engineers, not disagreeing with that. But don't give them too much power either. There has to be a bit of balance here, because certainly in this organisation, I can promise you, there were a number of individuals, because they were given so much power, they just acted as bad as any project manager that has the command and control authority about them that I've ever seen in any other organisation. So one has to understand that whilst the engineers are very, very useful and provide huge value, they shouldn't be running the business. The business runs the business, and the engineers should be coming up with solutions of how to. So as I wouldn't expect the business to come up with all the solutions of how to, I wouldn't expect the engineers to be telling the business how to run their business, and they don't really need that, they need this. So look, just be very, very careful here, because we can fall down a bit of a rabbit hole if our top talent in the organisation is starting to veer us off away. And I can tell you for one particular example in that particular organisation where very little got done in the team because an impasse was reached because of poor management on one hand and poor collaboration and communication on behalf of the engineers. So there's a bit of quid pro quo. It was neither one nor the other. It was both sets of people who caused issues. And beat yourself up. Okay, look, the only thing I'm taking away from this expression is just the expression itself. I see what Edward is trying to say. I hear what he's trying to say, which is actually, look, put yourself at the centre of the learning journey. But I can promise you this much for certain. You won't get a lot done if you put yourself under huge pressure and by beating yourself up. I can't tell you how many times I've gone into coaching conversations and had conversations with people who do exactly that. They're beating themselves up. They're putting themselves under undue stress and anxiety. And really it's just a reflection of what the organisation is doing. It's putting them under pressure. So I would never recommend beating yourself up because I don't really think it helps. I don't really think it works. What you actually need to do is, yes, put yourself at the centre of the learning journey, but chill. Give yourself a bit of time and space to think about things. Beating yourself up isn't going to solve anything. But as I say, I understand the point that Edward was trying to make, and it was a useful one. The leaders need to be at the centre of the learning journey. And again, at this particular organisation, the people who were learning last were the leaders. And again, command and control, authoritarian stuff that started with the guys who were coming in new to the organisation, and thought they knew what the solutions to the organisation ought to be. And that's after being in the organisation 10 minutes. This has taken a little longer than I would have expected, but I feel the points here are need to be made. So I'll put these books up and give you some links as well that Edward recommended. And I look forward to sharing with you on the next podcast, which is coming soon. I'm going to be speaking to John Wilson about change management and some of the flaws that occur in the lands of change management, and how sometimes we can get into traps in those particular past ways of doing things. Anyway, thank you for your time, and I look forward to catching up with you real soon.